Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want you to imagine a dying man on a cross.
Okay.
His wife and children are being executed right in front of him, and he is forced to watch them perish while he slowly suffocates.
Wow, that is a brutal image.
It is. And it sounds like a scene of standard Roman brutality, right?
Oh, absolutely. It sounds like something right out of the Roman playbook.
But the man ordering this mass crucifixion isn't a Roman emperor. He is a Jewish high priest.
Yeah, that is the part that usually shocks people.
Right. And the people dying on those crosses, they are his own countrymen. That horrific event is where the collision of religion, politics, and absolute control reached its terrifying peak. So today we're doing a deep dive into the 130-year gap between the Old and New Testaments.
The Hasmonean Era.
Yes, stretching from roughly 167 BC to 36 BC. And for you, the listener, understanding this era is, well, it's like finding the missing puzzle piece that makes the entire New Testament suddenly make sense.
It really is. It is a dark, fascinating, and crucial period of history. And before we get into the details of the Maccabean revolt, the rise of the priest-kings, and the eventual Roman takeover, we should probably clarify our theological framework.
Yes, that's a good idea.
We approach this history from a Protestant Reformed perspective. Because we adhere to the Westminster Confession of Faith, we do not view the primary texts of this era, specifically 1st and 2nd Maccabees, as inspired canonical scripture.
Right, they are part of the Apocrypha.
Correct. However, stripping them of canonical status does not strip them of their immense historical value. I mean, they are vital records.
They really are.
Through these texts, alongside the writings of the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, we see God's providence orchestrating world history. He was setting the political, cultural, and religious stage for the arrival of Jesus Christ.
That is a vital distinction for you, the listener, to keep in mind. We're reading history, not scripture.
Yeah, precisely.
And speaking of history, we need to establish how we know what we know. Today, we are relying on excerpts from Larry R. Hellier's work on the Hasmoneans.
And we also have a text edited by Joel B. Green and Lee Martin MacDonald, which deals specifically with the Pharisees.
Right. But looking at our primary ancient sources, it strikes me that reading 1st and 2nd Maccabees is, well, it is like reading a victorious general's personal memoir.
Oh, that is a great way to put it.
Yeah, because it is not an objective historical log. The authors have a clear, distinct bias. I mean, the common people, the average Jewish farmers and merchants, they only seem to appear as background props in this grand theater of the ruling class. The authors are clearly writing to justify a dynasty.
Your analogy of the victorious general's memoir is spot on. We always have to read ancient sources with a critical eye, recognizing the specific agenda of the author. Like the author of 1st Maccabees, for instance, was an ardent supporter of the Hasmonean family. He wrote his account to legitimize their political project, painting them as the exclusive saviors of Israel. The text is highly favorable to their dynasty.
But 2nd Maccabees is different, right?
Yes, very different. The author of 2nd Maccabees had a totally different agenda. He admired the early hero, Judas Maccabeus, but essentially ignored Judas's successors because he did not approve of their later political maneuvers.
That is so interesting.
It is, but both books, however, inadvertently let slip a fascinating truth. Many Jews were actually quite hostile to the nationalistic political agenda of the Hasmoneans.
That is a massive point. I mean, we often picture the entire Jewish nation rising up as one unified front against the Greeks, but the reality was far more fractured.
Oh, it was very fractured. The Hasmoneans were fighting a brutal two-front war. Yes, they were fighting the foreign Seleucid Empire, but they were also fighting against Hellenizing Jews.
Their own countrymen.
Exactly, their own countrymen who advocated for Greek assimilation. These Hellenizing Jews actively supported the agenda to turn Judea into a Greek temple state, complete with a gymnasium and Greek cultural norms.
Wow, and when we bring the historian Josephus into the mix, we get another layer of perspective.
We do. Josephus shows pride in the early Hasmonean achievements, but he does not conceal the horrific flaws and the moral rot of the later priest-kings. So a close reading of all these sources reveals dissenting voices that barely get a hearing in the official propaganda.
It really requires immense discernment to sift the facts from the spin.
It absolutely does.
So we have a messy, biased historical record, but it is the best we have. Let's set the stage for the listener. What was the catalyst for this entire rebellion?
Right. Why did the Jews go to war in the first place?
Yeah. It all begins with the tyrannical overreach of a Seleucid king named Antiochus V Epiphanes, who ruled the region from 175 to 164 BC.
He's a very ambitious guy.
He was incredibly ambitious, but according to our sources, he ran into a massive geopolitical roadblock. Yes. He was campaigning in Egypt, ready to conquer, when a Roman envoy essentially drew a line in the sand and forced him to withdraw under the threat of war with the Roman Republic.
Which was a humiliating public defeat for him.
Absolutely humiliating. Following this humiliation, he heard rumors that the Jews in Jerusalem thought he was dead and were celebrating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he responded by unleashing an unprecedented campaign of anti-Judaism.
To understand why he did this, we have to look at the mechanics of his empire. Antiochus realized that with the rising aggressive might of Rome breathing down his neck, he needed a culturally unified empire to withstand their expansion.
That makes political sense in a twisted way.
Right. Having a Jewish enclave situated right at the critical land bridge of his empire was a massive political liability.
Because they were so different.
Exactly. Here was a people fiercely devoted to an exclusive faith, worshiping only one god, and adhering to strict ritual purity laws that kept them separate from their neighbors.
They would not eat with Greeks, they would not worship Greek gods, and they would not assimilate.
Right. So Antiochus believed that the only way to secure his borders was to force cultural homogeneity.
He wanted everyone on the same page, worshiping the same gods, participating in the same economy, and sharing the same culture.
Yeah, that was his goal.
And to get that, he initiated what is often described as the first known religious persecution in recorded history. He decided to force Hellenistic assimilation at the point of a sword.
And the measures he unleashed were draconian. I mean, he issued official decrees that all citizens of his empire should be one people, demanding the Jews give up their specific covenantal customs.
The edicts targeted the very core of Jewish identity.
They really did. Mothers were forbidden to circumcise their infant sons. The Jewish people were commanded to openly profane the Sabbath day.
Which is unthinkable for them.
Right. And worst of all, they were ordered to make themselves ritually abominable by sacrificing unclean animals, specifically pigs, to pagan idols on their own altars.
Just to humiliate them.
Yeah, the explicit goal, as stated in the decrees, was that they would entirely forget the law of Moses and change all the ordinances of their faith. And if anyone was caught disobeying, the penalty was immediate execution.
I want the listener to really visualize this. Put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish family in the year 167 BC.
It is terrifying to even think about.
It is. Your entire life, your rhythm of time, your diet, your understanding of your standing before God is wrapped up in the Torah. Suddenly, foreign soldiers are walking through your streets demanding you eat pork and worship Zeus.
Yeah.
If you circumcise your newborn son as a sign of the covenant with God, soldiers will kill you and hang the infant from your neck. The sheer tension is suffocating.
Suffocating is a good word for it.
And that tension finally snapped in a small village called Modane, which was about 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem.
Yeah, the incident at Modane is the spark that ignited the entire powder keg.
How'd it play out?
Well, an official delegation from the king arrived in this quiet village to enforce the new edict. They set up a pagan altar in the center of the town and demanded a sacrifice to demonstrate loyalty to the Seleucid Empire.
And they picked a specific leader.
Right. Yes. They singled out an aged priest named Mattathias. He was a highly respected leader in the community, and they expected him to lead by example.
The classic strategy. Get the leader to cave, and the rest follow.
Right. The official likely thought that if Mattathias complied, the rest of the village would fall in line. But Mattathias steadfastly refused. He publicly declared that even if every other nation obeyed the king, he and his family would keep the covenant of their fathers.
That takes incredible courage. But then the unthinkable happens. Another Jewish man steps forward, volunteering to offer the pagan sacrifice on the altar.
He capitulates.
He does. And Mattathias reacts with absolute unrestrained fury. The texts compare him to Phinehas from the Book of Numbers, filled with zealous rage for the holiness of God.
He just completely snaps.
He does. Mattathias lunges forward and kills the apostate Jew right there on the altar. Then he turns his weapon on the king's delegate and kills him too.
Wow.
He tears down the pagan altar, turning the village square into a scene of chaos and bloodshed. He cries out, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me."
And that was it. The point of no return.
Right. And with that, he and his sons flee into the rugged Gophna Hills. It is a single violent act of defiance that triggers a national avalanche.
That moment altered the trajectory of world history. Mattathias and his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, they fled into the wilderness caves.
And they were not alone for long.
No, they weren't. These remote areas became a haven for other Jews who refused to assimilate. A significant group known as the Hasidians joined them.
Which translates to the pious one,
Yeah,
right?
yes, the pious ones. The Hasidians were fiercely devoted to the Torah and swelled the ranks of this nascent rebellion. At first, they had to operate strictly as a guerrilla force.
Because they couldn't just march out and fight a conventional war.
Right. They could not fight the massive Seleucid armies in open-pitched battles. Instead, they launched night raids.
What else did they do?
They tore down pagan altars in neighboring towns. They punished and killed apostate Jews, hidden Torah scrolls, and they forcibly circumcised Jewish boys to reverse the Hellenistic assimilation.
They were fighting for their spiritual survival.
They really were.
But Mattathias, being an old man, died shortly after sparking this revolt. He lit the match, but he left his sons facing a massive, highly trained imperial army.
That is a tough spot to be in.
It is. They desperately needed a military strategy to survive the inevitable retaliation from the Syrian forces.
That necessity brought his son Judas to the forefront. Judas assumed command of the insurgents, and he proved to be a military genius.
His leadership was staggering.
It was so staggering, so effective, that he earned the nickname Maccabeus.
Which means the hammer, right?
Yes, the hammer, or the mallet head. It was a fitting title, as he delivered violent, crushing blows against both the Hellenizing Jews and the Seleucid dynasty.
Even though he was completely outnumbered.
Massively outnumbered. Against vastly superior numbers and advanced weaponry, including war elephants and heavily armored phalanxes, Judas utilized the rugged Judean terrain to his advantage.
He used the landscape.
Right. He relied on stealth, rapid mobilization, and raw courage to score 4 stunning victories over the Seleucid forces.
Let me stop you right there, because I want to look at a strategic decision Judas made that feels incredibly jarring when reading the history.
Okay, what is that?
The sources mention that Judas, in his quest to secure political independence, forged a mutual defense pact with the Roman Republic.
He did, in 161 BC.
Right. This treaty sent shockwaves through the Seleucid regime because nobody wanted to provoke Rome. But I have to ask, was this a massive miscalculation?
That would be...
Well, we know how the story ends. This courtship dance with Rome eventually turns into a dance of death, resulting in the Romans destroying Jerusalem and burning the temple to the ground in AD 70. Did Judas invite the very empire that would eventually crush his people into his living room?
That is a brilliant observation, and it highlights the tension between immediate tactical necessity and long-term historical consequences.
Right, he was thinking about the present.
Yeah. In the immediate context of 161 BC, aligning with the rising might of the Roman Republic was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Judas needed a deterrent.
He needed a big brother to scare off the bullies.
Exactly. Rome was expanding its influence and loved nothing more than weakening the Seleucid Empire by supporting rebellious client states. By securing a pact with Rome, Judas essentially put a giant warning sign on Judea that said, "Attack us and you answer to the Roman Senate."
Wow, but it had a cost.
It did. However, as you pointed out, in the grand scheme of history, it introduced formal Roman influence into Judean politics. It opened a door that could never be closed, culminating in the disastrous Jewish revolts and the complete loss of sovereignty centuries later. But Judas was fighting a war for survival in the present, not the future.
He had to stop the bleeding right then and there.
He really did.
And his immediate victories allowed him to achieve something that millions of people still celebrate today. Those 4 initial victories gave Judas the momentum to march into Jerusalem and momentarily reoccupy the city.
It was a massive moral victory.
It was. He took control of the Temple Mount, though he could not dislodge the Seleucid troops barricaded in a massive fortress overlooking the temple known as the Akhrep.
Right, they were still stuck there.
Yeah, but he had the temple itself. He cleansed the sanctuary, removed the pagan idols, rebuilt the altar, and reinstituted proper covenantal worship.
The rededication of the temple was the emotional and spiritual climax of the early revolt.
Tell us about that day.
Well, on the 25th day of the month of Chislev, which falls around November or December in our calendar, in the year 164 BC, they instituted a massive celebration.
It must have been incredible.
They praised God with songs, harps, lutes, and cymbals, acting on the precise anniversary of the day the Gentiles had profaned the temple 3 years prior. They decreed that this days-long festival of dedication should be observed annually.
And this is Hanukkah.
Yes, this event is the historical origin of Hanukkah. It was a monumental religious victory for the Jewish people.
But the celebration did not last long because the reality of geopolitics set in.
It always does.
Yeah. Judas soon realized that simply having religious liberty and a clean temple in Jerusalem was not enough. The Jewish people were surrounded by intense, violent hostility from their Gentile neighbors.
The surrounding areas were very hostile.
Extremely. Jewish communities living in regions outside Judea, like Hebron, Gilead, Galilee, and the coastal plain, were facing outright annihilation. Their neighbors saw the Jewish uprising in Jerusalem and started attacking the vulnerable Jewish minority populations in their own cities.
This existential threat forced a major evolution in the nature of the rebellion.
It changed everything.
It did. Judas had to transition the movement from a strictly religious struggle for the freedom of the Torah into a full-blown political and military war.
He had to protect his people.
Right. He had to launch rapid rescue missions to save these isolated Jewish communities, bringing many of them back to Judea for safety. Because of this, the objective shifted. It was no longer just about the right to worship. It became a war for secure, defensible borders and political independence.
The logic makes sense. I mean, religious liberty means nothing if your neighbors are actively trying to wipe you off the map. You need a state. You need an army.
Yeah, you need infrastructure.
Eventually, the successor to the Seleucid throne, Antiochus IV, grew incredibly weary of this protracted conflict. He was dealing with rival claimants to his own throne back home and could not afford to keep fighting in Judea.
He was distracted.
So he opted for negotiations. He officially agreed to let the Jews live by their own laws as they did before, effectively ending the first phase of the War of Liberation. But Judas did not get to enjoy a peaceful retirement.
No, sadly, peace was entirely fleeting. Hostilities eventually resumed as new Seleucid rulers tried to reassert control, but the internal landscape of the Jewish rebellion had shifted drastically.
What changed internally?
Well, the Hasidians, those deeply pious fighters who formed the backbone of Judas's early army, abandoned him.
Really? Why?
They were satisfied with achieving mere religious freedom. Oh, wait, they were satisfied with just getting religious freedom back.
Right.
Once the Seleucids agreed to let them practice the Torah and worship at the temple, the Hasidians had no appetite for an ongoing, bloody political war of national expansion.
They just wanted to go home and worship.
Exactly. They viewed the fight as over. Having lost a massive portion of his fighting force, Judas Maccabeus was highly vulnerable.
And that led to his downfall.
It did. He fell in battle against a massive Seleucid army at Alosa in 161 BC. He was buried in the ancestral tomb at Modane, leaving his brothers to navigate a highly precarious situation.
With Judas dead, the sheer military brute force of the rebellion died with him. The Hasmoneans were backed into a corner.
They needed a new strategy.
Yeah, because when you can no longer win on the battlefield through tactical brilliance, you have to win in the throne room. You have to play politics. And that is precisely what the next brother, Jonathan, did to secure the survival of the state.
He was a very different kind of leader.
He was. If Judas was the hammer, Jonathan was the master of high-stakes geopolitical poker. He looked at the absolute chaos happening within the Syrian Empire and used it to extract massive concessions.
The transition from military insurgency to diplomatic manipulation is fascinating. Jonathan assumed leadership, and his tenure, stretching from 152 to 143 BC, is a masterclass in opportunistic statecraft.
What did he do?
Well, around 152 BC, the Seleucid Empire was fracturing from within. A man named Alexander Ballas claimed to be the legitimate heir to the throne and prepared to overthrow the incumbent ruler, Demetrius I.
A civil war.
Right. Both of these men were desperate for military allies in the civil war. Jonathan recognized his leverage. He let them engage in a bidding war for his military support.
It is brilliant. He basically says, whoever gives my people the best deal gets our swords.
Yeah, that was his play.
And the strategy paid off immensely.
It yielded staggering results. Through this bidding war, Jonathan managed to be appointed as a general and the governor of Judea.
That is a massive step up.
And even more significantly, Alexander Ballas appointed him as the high priest of the Jerusalem temple.
Wow. So he combined them.
Yes, a move that consolidated religious and political authority in one man. Jonathan extracted sweeping tax exemptions, territorial acquisitions, and the release of Jewish hostages held in the Acra fortress.
So they were legitimate now.
Completely. The ragtag group of guerrilla fighters hiding in the caves of the Gophna Hills had officially morphed into a recognized, formidable military state.
But playing high-stakes geopolitical poker with imperial generals is incredibly dangerous. One miscalculation, one misplaced trust, and you lose everything.
And that is what happened.
Yeah. Jonathan's story ends in a devastating betrayal. A Syrian military leader named Tryphon realized he could not defeat Jonathan's seasoned army in a fair fight on the battlefield, so he resorted to treachery.
This is a very sneaky move.
Tryphon dangled a diplomatic carrot. He promised to hand over the highly valuable seaport of Ptolemais to Jewish control. All Jonathan had to do was come inside the city to finalize the handover.
Right, Tryphon convinced Jonathan to leave the vast majority of his army behind in Galilee and enter the heavily fortified city of Ptolemais with only 1,000 troops as an honor guard.
Which was a huge mistake.
It was a fatal trap. As soon as Jonathan and his men were inside, the people of Ptolemais, colluding with Tryphon, slammed the city gates shut. They slaughtered the 1,000 Jewish soldiers, took Jonathan prisoner, and Tryphon eventually executed him. The nation was entirely stunned. They had lost their diplomatic mastermind.
Following Jonathan's murder, the mantle of leadership fell to the last remaining brother of the original five, Simon.
Simon took over.
Yes, he ruled from 143 to 135 BC. And under Simon, the Hasmoneans finally achieved the goal they had been bleeding for over 3 decades. They reached a watershed moment in Jewish history.
Simon proved to be an incredibly capable leader. In 142 BC, he capitalized on yet another shift in Seleucid politics. The new ruler, Demetrius II, was desperate for Simon's alliance against a rival faction.
More civil war for the Syrians.
Exactly. In exchange, Demetrius released the Hasmonean state from paying all tribute and canceled the oppressive crown tax.
That is a huge financial win.
It was. The Jewish texts declare this moment with incredible triumph, stating that the yoke of the Gentiles was removed from Israel.
I want to pause on that phrase. The yoke of the Gentiles was removed. For generations, the Jewish people lived as subjects, paying crippling taxes to foreign kings, having their wealth drained to fund foreign wars.
It was a heavy burden.
Suddenly, they are free. It was such a monumental achievement that the Jewish people actually reset their calendars.
They did.
They began dating their legal documents and contracts in reference to this event, writing, "In the first year of Simon, the great high priest and commander and leader of the Jews,"
They even struck their own coins.
which is the ultimate ancient symbol of sovereign autonomy.
It really is. And Simon solidified this newly recognized autonomy through massive physical consolidation and infrastructure projects.
Like what?
Well, in 141 BC, he achieved a massive psychological victory. For over 20 years, the Seleucid garrison stationed in the Acra fortress had loomed over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, constantly harassing the worshippers.
Just a constant reminder of foreign occupation.
Exactly. Simon instituted a blockade, starved out the foreign soldiers and the Hellenizing Jews hiding inside, and finally captured it.
And he didn't just capture it.
No, he did not just capture it, he razed the fortress to the ground, erasing the final physical reminder of Hellenistic dominance in the Holy City. He then fortified the city walls around Mount Sion and strengthened the defenses of the surrounding towns.
The people were so grateful for this era of peace and strength that they convened a massive public assembly. The priests, the leaders of the nation, and the elders officially decreed that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise.
They locked it in.
They etched this decree on bronze tablets and set them up in the temple precinct. They basically established a new royal dynasty. But despite all this success, Simon's life ends with a terrible, tragic irony.
The irony is, well, it is devastating. After successfully outmaneuvering the might of foreign empires, surviving countless battles, and securing the borders of his nation, Simon met a violent death, not on a battlefield facing a foreign enemy, but at a banquet table facing his own family.
That is just awful.
In 134 BC, his own son-in-law, a man named Ptolemy, who had been appointed governor of the Jericho region, invited Simon and 2 of his sons to a feast.
And he betrayed them.
He got them drunk and had hidden assassins murder them in a vain, ambitious attempt to seize absolute authority over the nation for himself.
This domestic assassination signals a very dark turning point in our narrative. We are moving from the era of the heroic liberators into the era of the priest-kings. And this is the most troubling part of the history we are examining.
It is where things go off the rails.
The original Hasmoneans, Mattathias, Judas, they fought and died to defend the Torah from pagan corruption. They were zealous for the holiness of God. But as we look at the subsequent generations of their descendants, we see a shocking, rapid moral decline.
They change completely.
They seem to morph into the exact, despotic, power-hungry, Hellenistic monarchs they originally went to war against.
Applying our Reformed theological lens here provides a crucial framework for understanding this shift. This era perfectly illustrates the doctrine of human total depravity.
Can you unpack that for the listener?
Sure. Total depravity does not mean humans are as evil as they could possibly be at all times. Rather, it means that sin has entirely infected every aspect of our nature, our minds, our wills, our desires.
So nobody's immune.
Right. And what we see in the Hasmonean dynasty is a terrifying case study. Once given absolute political authority, immense wealth, and freedom from accountability, even a family whose roots were in righteous rebellion and zeal for God's covenant descended into unimaginable cruelty, ambition, and sin. Control corrupts, and fallen human nature cannot handle absolute control without turning it into tyranny.
Let us break down how that tyranny manifested. The third generation begins with Simon's surviving son, John Hyrcanus I, who ruled from 185 to 104 BC.
He had a rough start.
He did. John Hyrcanus managed to survive the assassination plot that killed his father and brothers, but his reign started with severe setbacks. The Seleucid ruler, Antiochus VII, marched into Judea, besieged Jerusalem, and forced Hyrcanus into submission.
So they lost the independence.
Right. Hyrcanus had to pay a massive tribute, watch the city walls get torn down again, and hand over hostages, including his own brother. It looked like all the hard-won independence was evaporating.
But geopolitical winds shift rapidly. Hyrcanus caught a massive break when Antiochus VII was killed in a disastrous military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east.
The Syrian army fell apart.
It was decimated, and the empire plunged back into internal chaos. Hyrcanus immediately seized the opportunity. He stopped all tribute payments, sent envoys to Rome to renew their mutual defense pact and keep any new Syrian retaliation at bay, and launched an aggressive, massive campaign of territorial expansion.
He went on the offensive.
He operated much like a secular Hellenistic king, hiring foreign mercenaries to bolster his army because he could no longer rely entirely on Jewish volunteers who were increasingly alienated by his political ambition.
And where did he expand?
Well, he went north and south, conquering vital trade routes.
He marched into Samaria, and in 128 BC, he completely destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim.
Which was a massive statement.
It was a massive religious and political statement asserting the absolute supremacy of the Jerusalem temple. But it is his campaign in the south that really exposes the moral rot of his reign. He conquered the Edomians, the descendants of the Edomites, and he presented them with a chilling ultimatum.
The ultimatum was simple: convert to Judaism, which mandated circumcision and adherence to the Torah, or face total expulsion from your ancestral lands.
That is just brutal.
Faced with the loss of their homes and livelihoods, the Edomians chose forced conversion. They were absorbed into the Jewish nation at the point of a sword.
The hypocrisy is staggering. Forced conversion by the sword is the precise tactic Antiochus Epiphanes tried to inflict on the Jewish people decades earlier.
It is the exact same thing.
The Hasmoneans went to war to stop forced assimilation, and now, a generation later, they are inflicting it on their neighbors to expand their tax base and secure their borders. They had become the very monsters they fought.
And it gets significantly worse when we look at the fourth generation.
Tell us about them.
The descent into outright tyranny accelerates with Aristobulus I, the son of John Hyrcanus, who ruled briefly from 104 to 103 BC.
Only 1 year.
Yeah, but he did a lot of damage. Aristobulus was not content with the title of high priest or ethnarch. He craved the prestige of the Gentile rulers around him, so he formally assumed the title of king and wore a royal diadem.
Which upset a lot of people.
Oh, greatly. The blending of the high priesthood with the kingship offended many devout Jews who believed the kingship belonged exclusively to the line of David.
But he didn't care.
Not at all. Aristobulus did not care about theological propriety. He cared about dominance. To secure his throne, he imprisoned his own mother and deliberately starved her to death.
That is insane.
He also grew paranoid regarding his brother Antigonus and had him treacherously executed based on false rumors of a coup.
Starving his own mother to death.
Yeah.
That tells the listener everything they need to know about the state of this family. But the violence reached its absolute horrific nadir during the reign of his brother, Alexander Jannaeus, who took over and ruled from 103 to 76 BC.
He was a very brutal man.
Under Jannaeus, the policy of military expansion reached its absolute peak. Through relentless warfare and the heavy use of foreign mercenaries, he pushed the borders of the Hasmonean kingdom to essentially equal the vast territory once ruled by King David and King Solomon. On a map, the nation looked incredibly strong.
On a map, yes, but that external expansion masked severe, festering internal rot. Janaeus was a brutal, deeply unpopular ruler among the common people.
Did he have brother issues too?
He did. Like his predecessor, he executed another one of his brothers out of sheer paranoia. His entire reign was marked by constant warfare, not just against foreign nations, but against his own people.
He fought his own people.
Yes, he aligned himself politically with the aristocratic Sadducees who supported his Hellenistic royal lifestyle, and he fiercely alienated the popular party of the Pharisees, who demanded strict adherence to the Torah and opposed his corruption of the high priesthood.
And that boiled over.
The tension erupted into a full-scale, bloody civil war that raged for 6 years, costing the lives of tens of thousands of Jews.
And this civil war culminated in the event I mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive. The event the sources refer to as a day of infamy.
It is a dark day.
The Pharisees had actually allied with a foreign Syrian king to try and overthrow Janaeus. When Janaeus finally defeated the rebellion, his vengeance was apocalyptic. He captured 800 of his leading Pharisaic opponents.
800 men.
He brought them to Jerusalem. And while he threw a lavish banquet for his concubines, he had all 800 men crucified. And while they were hanging on the crosses, agonizing in their final hours, he ordered their wives and children to be dragged out and slaughtered right before their eyes.
It is a profound, horrifying historical tragedy. I mean, the grandsons and great-grandsons of men who willingly died in caves to protect the Torah were now utilizing the most brutal execution methods of the pagan empires to murder the very people trying to observe the law.
It is completely upside down.
The internal bloodshed and the deep fractures generated by leaders like Alexander Janaeus created a massive structural vulnerability within the nation. The society was tearing itself apart from the inside.
And when a society does that, it invites trouble.
Right. In the ancient world, internal fracturing is an open invitation for external opportunists. This horrific civil strife set the stage for Rome's eventual permanent takeover.
To help the listener understand how Rome got involved, let us use an analogy. It is like two rival CEOs destroying their own massive corporation in a bitter, petty boardroom dispute.
I like this analogy.
They are tanking the stock, fighting over assets, and eventually they invite a massive predatory hedge fund to come in and mediate the dispute. By the time the mediation is over, neither CEO has a job, and the hedge fund owns the entire company.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
That is essentially what the next generation of Hasmoneans did with the Roman Empire.
The transition to Roman rule began after a brief, surprisingly peaceful reprieve. Following the death of Alexander Janaeus, his widow, Queen Shalomzian Alexandra, took the throne and ruled from 76 to 67 BC.
A queen ruling alone was rare.
Very rare. According to historical accounts, Janaeus gave her deathbed advice to reconcile with the Pharisees, knowing their popularity with the masses was essential for stability.
So she listened to him.
She followed his advice, switching royal patronage to the Pharisees, which brought a period of relative peace and prosperity. Because a woman could not serve as high priest, she appointed her eldest son, a very passive man named Hyrcanus II, to the priesthood.
But the peace died the moment she died.
Yes, it did.
She had a younger son, Aristobulus II, who was incredibly ambitious, energetic, and heavily supported by the military and the Sadducees. Upon the queen's death, deadly animosity erupted between the two brothers.
Brother against brother again.
Aristobulus II executed a rapid military coup, defeated his older brother's forces, and forced Hyrcanus II to resign from both the kingship and the high priesthood, retreating to a quiet private life.
And that might have been the end of the story. With Aristobulus II ruling securely, if not for the introduction of a massive, shadowy new player in our historical narrative.
Who's that?
A man named Antipater the Idumean entered the political fray. Antipater was an incredibly wealthy and cunning political operator. He's also the father of the man who would eventually become known as Herod the Great.
Wow, so Herod's family enters the picture.
Yes, and remember the brutal irony from earlier. The Idumeans were the very people John Hyrcanus had forced to convert to Judaism by the sword decades prior. Now, an Idumean was about to orchestrate the downfall of the Hasmonean dynasty.
And Antipater sees the passive, ousted Hyrcanus II as the perfect puppet. He approaches Hyrcanus and essentially says, "Your brother is going to kill you to secure his throne. You need to fight back, and I will help you."
He totally plays him.
Antipater leverages his vast wealth to enlist the military support of the neighboring Nabatean king, Aretas. Suddenly, Hyrcanus II has a massive army at his back. He marches on Jerusalem, defeats Aristobulus' forces in battle, and traps his brother in a protracted siege on the Temple Mount.
So the nation is once again bleeding out in a civil war between two brothers.
Exactly.
And while the brothers were slaughtering each other in Jerusalem, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically.
Rome showed up.
Yes. In 63 BC, the legendary Roman general Pompey the Great arrived in Syria, having just conquered vast territories in the east. Pompey represented the sheer, unstoppable might of the Roman Republic.
He was a titan.
Recognizing that Rome was now the ultimate deal-maker in the region, both brothers, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, sent delegations to Pompey, offering massive bribes and pleading their respective cases to gain Roman backing.
This is the moment the rival CEOs invite the hedge fund into the boardroom.
Right.
But what is truly fascinating is that a third delegation showed up to speak to Pompey.
The people.
Yes, a massive group of Jewish citizens, thoroughly sickened by the bloodshed, corruption, and tyranny of the Hasmonean family, approached the Roman general. They emphatically rejected both brothers.
They wanted nothing to do with them.
They asked Pompey to abolish the monarchy altogether and restore the old system where priests managed religious affairs and left the politics alone. They essentially begged Rome to save them from their own kings.
Pompey listened to all three delegations and initially commanded them to wait for his official decision. But Aristobulus II was impatient and distrustful. He fled the proceedings and retreated to Jerusalem to fortify his military position, preparing to fight.
You do not run from Pompey.
No, you do not. Pompey, who did not tolerate insubordination, responded with overwhelming force. He marched his Roman legions on Jerusalem.
How did the siege go?
Well, the supporters of Hyrcanus II opened the city gates to the Romans, but the supporters of Aristobulus barricaded themselves on the fortified Temple Mount. Pompey constructed a massive siege wall, brought up battering rams, and after 3 brutal months, he violently crushed all resistance.
And he entered the temple, didn't he?
He did. He even brazenly walked into the Holy of Holies in the temple, an act that deeply traumatized the Jewish psyche, though he surprisingly left the temple treasures untouched.
So the hedge fund has completely taken over the company. Pompey issues his verdict. He strips the Hasmonean state of its vast, conquered territories, reducing Judea to a small, subservient province.
The empire was over.
He reinstates Hyrcanus II as high priest and gives him the lesser title of ethnarch. But the real sovereignty now belongs to Rome. Judea is a Roman client state subject to heavy taxation.
Back to paying taxes to Gentiles.
Right. Aristobulus and his family are shipped off to Rome in chains to be paraded in Pompey's military triumph. And operating entirely behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the passive Hyrcanus II, is Antipater the Idumean.
The real winner in all this.
Antipater becomes the true authority behind the throne, steadily installing his own sons into key governorships across the region. The era of genuine Hasmonean independence was officially dead.
There was, however, one final chaotic gasp of Hasmonean ambition.
Oh, right, Antiochus.
Yes. Years later, a prince from the 6th generation named Mattathias Antigonus, the son of the exiled Aristobulus II, saw an opportunity. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in civil wars following the assassination of Julius Caesar.
They were distracted again.
Taking advantage of Roman distraction, Antigonus allied with the invading Parthian Empire. In 40 BC, Parthian forces swept into Judea, overthrew the local government, and installed Antigonus as king and high priest.
And Antigonus knew he had to permanently neutralize his uncle, Hyrcanus II, who still held the legitimate claim to the priesthood.
He had to get rid of him.
He could not just kill him, because that might spark a rebellion among Hyrcanus' supporters. So Antigonus resorted to a brutal technicality.
The ear-biting.
Yes, Jewish law mandated that a high priest must be free of any physical blemish or mutilation. Antigonus personally attacked his uncle and bit or cut off his ears, permanently disqualifying him from ever holding the sacred office again. But this brutal, brief reign by Antigonus was doomed from the start.
It was doomed because Antipater's highly capable and ruthless son, Herod, managed to escape the chaos in Jerusalem.
He ran to Rome.
Herod traveled all the way to Rome, navigating the treacherous political waters of the Roman Senate. He brilliantly pleaded his case before Mark Antony and Octavian.
And they liked him.
Impressed by his loyalty and capability, the Roman Senate conferred upon Herod the title of King of the Jews and provided him with massive military backing.
So he came back with an army.
Herod returned to Judea, fought a brutal, grinding 3-year war against Antigonus, and finally captured Jerusalem in 37 BC. The Romans took the defeated Antigonus away and, at Herod's urging, beheaded him.
Herod the Great is now on the throne. But Herod knew his claim was entirely illegitimate in the eyes of the Jewish people. He was an Idumean whose family converted by force. He had no royal blood.
He was very insecure about that.
So to secure his grip on control, he launched a systematic, horrifying campaign of extermination against every remaining member of the Hasmonean family.
Herod's paranoia and ruthlessness knew no bounds. He executed the elderly, mutilated Hyrcanus II, fearing he might still be used as a figurehead for rebellion.
This is just sad.
Most tragically, Herod executed his own wife, Miriam, who was a beautiful Hasmonean princess he had married to try and legitimize his role.
He killed his own wife.
Driven by insane jealousy and court intrigue, he had her killed. He then executed her mother, Alexandra. He orchestrated a convenient drowning accident in a swimming pool in Jericho for his teenage brother-in-law, Aristobulus III, who had become wildly popular when Herod briefly appointed him as high priest.
A total purge.
Eventually, as he neared the end of his life, Herod even sentenced and strangled his own 2 sons by Miriam, fearing they would use their Hasmonean bloodline to usurp him. Through relentless bloodshed, the political dynasty of the Maccabees was violently erased from the earth.
The political dynasty was dead, but here's where we bridge the gap for the listener. The religious and cultural landscape the Hasmoneans created over those 130 years directly set the stage for the New Testament world.
It is the background for everything in the Gospels.
You open the Gospel of Matthew, and suddenly you are confronted with Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, massive Hellenistic cities, and deep political unrest. This entire world traces its origins right back to the Maccabean revolt.
It does.
I want to look closely at one specific group, the Pharisees. We mentioned earlier that their historical roots likely lie with the Hasidians, those zealous, pious fighters who fought in the caves alongside Judas to protect the Torah.
Right, the early heroes.
So how did a group of heroic, zealous freedom fighters end up evolving into the primary antagonists of Jesus, fixated on rigid external purity and man-made traditions? What is the mechanism behind that shift?
The evolution of the Pharisees is a crucial piece of the theological puzzle. The very name Pharisee likely derives from a Hebrew root word meaning one who is separate.
Separate from what?
Separate from impurity. Their origins are deeply tied to the trauma of the exile and the subsequent Maccabean crisis. They witnessed the horrific consequences of idolatry and assimilation. Their foundational goal was actually quite noble.
What were they trying to do?
They wanted to ensure that the entire Jewish nation, not just the temple priests, strictly kept the Torah in their daily lives. They believed that widespread, rigorous obedience would secure God's blessing and hasten the arrival of the Messianic age, while compromise would invite God's wrath, as it did under Antiochus.
It is the logic of a traumatized people. If we just obey perfectly, God will protect us, and the pagans will never crush us again.
Exactly.
To achieve that perfect obedience, they started building what they called a fence around the Torah.
Precisely. They developed an exhaustive system of oral traditions known as Hanukkah, which was the practical interpretation and application of the written law.
Like filling in the blanks.
Yes. If the Torah said, "Do not work on the Sabbath," the Pharisees took it upon themselves to meticulously define what constituted work. How far could you walk? Could you tie a knot? Could you carry a mat?
Very granular.
Over the decades, their intense concern for maintaining separation from Gentile impurity rigidified into a massive burden of regulation.
And according to Josephus, they were massively popular among the common people.
They were the party of the people.
The Sadducees were the wealthy aristocrats and the temple elite. But the Pharisees lived among the masses. They had immense grassroots support. They were considered the unrivaled experts in the law, the local synagogue leaders who guided daily life.
People really looked up to them.
They took immense pride in being the most observant, the most separated, the most pure faction of Judaism.
Because of their reputation as accurate interpreters of the law, they wielded immense societal and religious influence. But this rigid adherence to oral tradition and external boundary markers is precisely the mechanism that led to their frequent, fierce clashes with Jesus.
Jesus was not focused on the fence.
No, he was not. When you read the Gospels, the disputes are almost never about the core moral law. They are about areas of external piety and halakha. Jesus clashed with them over tithing tiny garden herbs like mint and cumin, over the proper protocols for fasting, over the necessity of ritual hand-washing before meals, and over their incredibly restrictive Sabbath rules.
They lost the plot.
The original noble desire for national holiness had calcified over a century into a heavy, suffocating burden of legalism. They had elevated their fence around the Torah to the same authority as the Torah itself.
The zeal for purity turned into a mechanism for control. We also see the rise of other major sects during this Hasmonean period, driven by the same fracturing. Let us look at the Qumran community.
The Essenes.
Yes, generally identified by scholars as the Essenes. They feature prominently in the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. This group completely abandoned mainstream Jewish society.
They just walked away.
They produced sectarian literature detailing a bitter, violent conflict between a figure they called the wicked priest and their own founder, the teacher of righteousness.
The identity of the wicked priest is heavily debated among historians.
Who are the candidates?
Some scholars argue it was Jonathan or Simon, pointing to their illegitimate usurpation of the high priesthood. Others make a compelling case that it was the brutal Alexander Jannaeus, the man who crucified the 800 Pharisees.
Either way, they hated the leadership.
Regardless of the specific identity, the dynamic is clear. The Qumran community viewed the Hasmonean high priesthood as deeply, hopelessly corrupted. In response, they withdrew entirely into the harsh Judean desert.
They went to the wilderness.
They set up an isolated, monastic-style community at Qumran, binding themselves to intensely strict interpretations of the Torah, apocalyptic expectations, and ritual bathing. They believed they were the true, pure remnant of Israel, waiting in the wilderness for God to judge the corrupt authorities in Jerusalem.
So the Hasmonean era birthed the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. That fragmentation of Judaism into competing rival sects is a direct legacy of the political choices made by the priest-kings.
The old consensus was shattered.
The old theological consensus forged during the Persian era completely shattered under the pressure of Hellenism and self-rule. And speaking of Hellenism, we have to look at the staggering paradox of this entire 130-year narrative.
It is a massive paradox.
The Maccabean revolt started as a violent, zealous war to completely eradicate Greek culture from Judea. Yet, over the generations, the Hasmonean rulers eventually integrated the very culture they fought against into the fabric of their nation.
It is the ultimate historical irony. Archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates the steady creep of Hellenistic integration.
What do they find?
Under the later Hasmoneans, new cities were laid out using the hippodamic plan, which is the classic Greek grid pattern of streets intersecting at right angles. They transitioned from traditional mud brick construction to using finely hewn ashlar masonry, a Greek technique.
So they built like Greeks.
They began importing and utilizing Hellenistic luxury goods like fine glass and foreign wine. We even see it in their death practices.
Like the tombs.
Yes. When Simon Maccabeus renovated the family tomb in Modian, he integrated massive, imposing elements of Greek monumental architecture, including carved panoplies of armor and ships, to project prestige in a way the Greeks would understand and respect. Over time, Hellenism became completely indigenous to Jewish Palestine. They absorbed the culture of the empire they defeated.
And the bloodline of this complicated family continued to intersect with the New Testament narrative long after the dynasty fell.
It survived through Herod's line.
The Hasmonean blood, mixed with the Idumean line of Herod through Mariam, carried on into the 9th and 10th generations. When you read the book of Acts, you encounter King Herod Agrippa III, who arrested the Apostle Peter and executed James.
He had Hasmonean blood.
He did. His son, King Agrippa II, is the ruler who sat and listened to the Apostle Paul's masterful defense in Caesarea. And you have the infamous women of the Gospels, Herodias, who manipulated the political situation to orchestrate the death of John the Baptist, and her daughter Salome, whose dance resulted in the prophet's head being delivered on a silver platter.
The legacy lived on.
They were all descendants, carrying the dark, violent, and complicated legacy of this family line.
It is a dark legacy, undoubtedly. But as we synthesize this history, we must be careful not to entirely dismiss the early Hasmoneans.
Give them their due.
Despite the catastrophic moral failures, the bloody civil wars, and the eventual surrender to Roman domination by the later generations, we must acknowledge the immense theological and historical legacy of the founders.
They did save the faith.
Without the initial, uncompromising rebellion of Mattathias and Judas in the Gophna Hills, the Jewish faith might have been entirely wiped out, assimilated into the pagan soup of the Seleucid Empire. They preserved monotheism in the land of Israel at a critical juncture in history.
That is a fair point.
Furthermore, the stories of early Maccabean zeal deeply impacted subsequent generations. The horrifying account in 2 Maccabees of the Jewish mother and her 7 sons, who bravely chose horrific torture and death rather than violate God's law by eating pork, became a foundational text for early Christians.
It inspired the martyrs.
Those Jewish martyrs inspired thousands of Christian martyrs facing the lions in Roman arenas centuries later.
It is incredibly heavy history to process. But understanding this violent, chaotic 130-year period provides a high-definition, brilliant background to the Gospels for you, the listener. It explains the tension in every interaction Jesus has.
It sets the whole scene.
You can now see precisely why the crowds in Jerusalem during Jesus' time were so intensely desperate for a political military messiah to overthrow the Roman occupation. They were not just dreaming of ancient King David from 1,000 years prior. They were longing for the good old days of Hasmonean autonomy.
They wanted independence back.
They remembered a time, just a century before they were born, when a zealous Jewish warrior took up a sword, utilized brilliant tactics, defeated a pagan empire, cleansed the temple, and established a sovereign state. When they looked at Jesus, they expected him to be the new Judas Maccabeus.
They desperately wanted a hammer to smash the Romans. They expected a military conqueror who would ride in on a war horse.
But they got something else.
Instead, God sent the suffering servant who rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. The contrast between the earthly kingdom the Hasmoneans tried to build with the sword, which eventually collapsed into tyranny and bloodshed, and the eternal spiritual kingdom that Christ inaugurated through the sacrifice of the cross, is the ultimate lesson of this era.
Which leaves us with a challenging theological question for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. The Hasmoneans began with a pure, righteous desire to defend God's holy law. They were entirely willing to die in caves for it.
They had good intentions.
But within just a few generations, they ended up crucifying their own people to maintain their political control and wealth. Look at this historical record. Look at the devastation of the priest kings and ask yourself, what happens to faith when believers decide that wielding the earthly, violent sword of state authority is the best way to advance the kingdom of God? Thank you for tuning in to Reformed Thinking.